Today on CityCast Chicago, big questions hang over the city's head this week, like what's the future of Chicago's sanctuary city status? What's next for CTA after Dorval Carter's exit? And does CPS have a plan for Acero school families? Plus, we're talking Dolphins, Coyotes, and birds. We've got Block Club Chicago's Francia Garcia Hernandez and Michael Liptrot in the building. It's Friday, January 17th. I'm Jacoby Cochran, and this is what Chicago's talking about. Morning, my friends. How y'all feeling today? Francia, nice to have you with us.
Hello. Good to be here. Feeling good. Feeling happy that it's Friday.
Michael, it's good to have you as well, G. How you feeling today?
Thank you, man. I'm great to be here, and thank you for having me.
If you're a long-term listener to CityCast, you might know we got two newcomers in the building, but Block Club Chicago is not new. We are so happy to have both of y'all here for the first time. And for everybody listening, whenever, wherever, and however fast, and whether you are new or been here for a better part of 950 plus episodes, thank you for making time for CityCast Chicago. This week, we talked political power rankings in the city, ways we'd spend $500,000 in our wards, best and worst restaurant week deals, and MLK's legacy right here in the city. And like every Friday, we've got two amazing folks here to help us look back on some stories from the week. And speaking of restaurant week, we had Paige Serena on the podcast earlier this week. It's always a good time to go out and try restaurants. Maybe you are excited to try ones you want to dip and dabble into. Michael, I'm going to start with you. Is there a restaurant in Chicago that you are excited to try, whether it's for restaurant week or outside of it?
Well, restaurant week, for me, there's been some that have been on my radar, but actually looking through the list, they're not included. So, like, I got into the Bear and watching places like Asama and stuff. I don't quite see it on here. But then again, these are Michelin star restaurants, so I don't know if they don't need the deal to particularly bring traffic to them. But still, I'm looking at some brunch spots. I see Michael Jordan's Steakhouse on here. Benihana, I've never been to a Benihana, and I always thought it was kind of hype, but I might check it out.
I eventually had to go to a Benihana as well. 2 Chainz talked about it too much, man. I eventually had to see what it was for.
There's one of those things where it's like, to a lot of people, that's a sign of wealth to go to a Benihana. It's like the mama I made it moment. So I may end up checking some of those places out because, to be honest, I've been in Chicago 2 years, and I haven't quite found that one restaurant where it really gets me going to get excited thinking about going to eat there. I'm still looking for that personally.
Okay, I'm hoping you find it during restaurant week or sometime. I'm hoping that for you. Francia, is there a place in Chicago you're really excited to try?
Yeah, well, I'm actually gonna return. It's one of my favorites, and Cafe Baba Riba, their tapas brunch is amazing. And it's on the list for restaurant week, I think for brunch, lunch, and maybe dinner. So I might try something different and go at night. Not sure, but I love that place and I'll go back anytime. And restaurant week just gives me a perfect excuse.
Francia, city and state leaders, immigrant advocates, and protesters were out on Monday speaking against an amendment that would allow Chicago police to essentially coordinate with ICE and federal immigration officials. They were citing human rights violations, impact on Chicago's immigrant communities, and financial penalties to the city. Francia, who brought forth this amendment in City Council and why?
Yeah, so last week, two Southwest Side older people, Ray Lopez of the 15th Ward and Silvana Tavares, brought forward this proposal to amend the Welcoming City Ordinance and create some what they call carve-outs, which essentially would kind of identify specific crimes, in their words, that would make police be allowed to cooperate with immigration authorities if they detain somebody. So that was the ordinance introduced last week. We reported about it and some initial reactions from immigration advocates saying, this really didn't create a path for a safe or due process for people because, you are presumed to be innocent until you're charged and proven guilty. So there are potential issues there. One of the things that I heard from a former immigration leader in the city under Mayor Lori Lightfoot's administration is that this also assumes that authorities are always right in identifying who might be a good or bad person or a good or bad immigrant, which is obviously a divisive narrative, but it's also not accurate, right? Like there is no guarantee that they can always get that right. So they raised those concerns back last week. And then obviously this week we saw a big turnout at city council.
And while the two alders did list some specific crimes like prostitution, human trafficking, sexual crimes involving minors, there were also very vague things like gang-related activities, selling and buying drugs, which again, these are oftentimes narratives that are created. Like at one point, Chicago's very problematic gang database could be used to identify someone, and then under this amendment would essentially give Chicago police and federal agents the go ahead to work together on something as basic as being on a database. Advocates and officials consistently push back, saying that this would be a violation of state laws, would be dangerous and consequential for immigrants, both people who are new arrivals, people who are undocumented, and people who are long-term residents of the city of Chicago. So how did this vote go earlier this week?
The ordinance failed. That proposal to change it failed. So far, no changes to the welcoming city ordinance. Everything stays the same. I do want to highlight one thing that, these alders proposed this as a way to protect the immigrant community by kind of showing that the city is willing to cooperate with the Trump administration and help authorities prosecute or go after immigrants, especially who are considered like guilty of doing criminal activity. But again, as you mentioned, there are just so many vague statements there that it just leaves a lot of room for gray areas and interpretation and potential human rights violations. The other thing is that there's a myth that if police detain somebody, that they cannot know who they're detaining. But, usually authorities nationwide, they'll process someone and they'll fingerprint them. So that is shared with federal authorities. And that's something that's been brought forward by the ACLU and other immigration and civil rights organizations.
WTTW reminded us earlier this week that the city has been a self-proclaimed sanctuary city for almost 40 years, with 5 mayors vowing to shield all immigrants in Chicago from federal agents, regardless of whether they're citizens, permanent residents, or asylum seekers. But as you said, there are already so many ways in which federal law enforcement and local law enforcement work together in ways that, in some ways, small and big, skirt around this. How are people feeling in the neighborhoods that you cover?
Well, I cover Pilsen Little Village, back of the yards, which have been, in a way, safe havens for immigrant communities for a long time. So there was a strong reaction against these proposed ordinance from local organizations, from neighbors, from elected officials, as you would expect, right? This is also happening as many are fearful of what's coming come Monday, January 20th, and what has been said will be the start of mass deportations here in Chicago. So there is a lot of anxiety already and fear, but I think one of the things I saw is people really got together and reacted and said, we're going to defend the sanctuary status. Now, I have to say, this proposal was brought forward by Southwest Side aldermen who lead Latino wards. The Trump results also kind of show that there are different perspectives in the Latino community, and some of them are built on, there are immigrants who have been here undocumented for more than 3 decades, contributed to the economy, raised families here, paid taxes, and they still don't have a legal pathway to citizenship or to anything. So they're seeing these newcomers as a threat because they're getting work permits right away, right? So I think they're looking at the people, not the system in a way sometimes. And that's how these divisions and these tensions start to arise. And then they're politicized and they're made bigger. And I don't want to, discredit anybody's feelings, because both groups of immigrants, whether they're new to the city in the last 18 months or so, or they've been here for 30 years, have had their challenges. But I think that's where the divide is brewing, and that's where sometimes some undocumented immigrants might stand behind a proposal like that, because they think it'll protect them a little bit more after decades of waiting for some change that would protect them and seeing nothing.
On Monday, while advocates were outside of City Hall protesting, CTA boss Dorval Carter was announcing his decision to step down as the boss of CTA at the end of the month. Michael, can you remind folks how long has Carter been in this position and what was his tenure largely like?
Yeah, so Dorval Carter has been head of the CTA since 2015, when then Mayor Ron Emanuel brought Carter in to lead the CTA. And uh, his time, especially the past couple years, has really been just marred in infamy. Is more and more mounting issues have raised, investigations revealing that he isn't even taking the CTA. His vacation schedule coming out, and people seeing how much of his time is spent not even in Chicago or America. So a lot was building up to this. And just with the declining public favor of the CTA and declining confidence in his leadership, this came as no surprise. But hey, he's leaving and retiring from CTA to lead a hospital group. It's not quite over as far as like his career, though he's retiring. So he's definitely still going to be around.
Yeah, he's going on to lead St. Anthony Hospital, which he's been on the board for the better part of the last decade. I believe in his letter, they talked about his father having a deep connection with the hospital, working there for 40 years. He started his career as a staff attorney with CTA back in the 80s. He spent some time working with the Department of Transportation, came back in 15. And as I was reading through his sort of retirement letter, which is really isn't a retirement because he's transitioning to a new job, it really feels like they're giving him that sort of ceremonial out, which is really he's quitting and taking another job amidst harsh controversy, growing public scrutiny, and as you said, declining public favor overall with CTA. But one thing I did get as I looked through his letter was they mentioned how he oversaw $11 billion in projects that have been completed, begun, or announced in the last 8 years. And about half of that is the Red Line extension, which, I said earlier this week, speak of good timing. With everything sort of bad being thrown his way, he's going out on the biggest project that CTA could secure and has ever secured in its history. Michael, what is next? Because he's leaving on the wave of the announcement of the Red Line extension, but again, we're not just talking about public scoring here. We're talking about real financial concerns at CTA. Who is the interim leader coming in, and what are the challenges them and their eventual replacement, if not them? What are they facing?
Yeah, so Nora Learson is going to be replacing Dorval Carter, and she had served as the chief of staff for CTA, and she'll start on February 1st. And this is going to be a big microscope on Brandon Johnson amid everything he's been going through with the CPS CTU debacle. Now it's on him to nominate a replacement. And if you remember, he just had a board pick for the RTA rejected not too long ago.
People are tired of seeing these transit board seats, whether on CTA or at the regional level, sort of go to community figures that are close to the mayors. This is a long-term criticism, not only in Chicago, but especially in Chicago. And it's continued largely unchecked when it comes to, these pastors getting these board seats.
Right. And especially, as you said, community leaders and how much real specific expertise is needed related to a job versus someone being a known name and a known figure in the community. And when you think about all of the nuances and intricacies that you need to understand to run the transit authority compared to just raw leadership and moral stop. and other aspects of pastor works, especially when you think about just the history of Chicago communities, particularly the history of the Black community. Pastors are a nucleus for a lot of communities.
Right. We're definitely not arguing that they don't have a voice and a specific role in their community, serve as a person of great influence that people go to. But if you sit in front of the approving committee and they ask you about the nearly $600 million fiscal cliff forthcoming, and you almost are like, I don't know what the hell you're talking about.
Right.
People gonna ask the questions.
Right. And when you think about the knowledge that is needed, because though with a lot of organizations, the leaders, they're not doing the day-to-day work, but an understanding of. And when you have a proposed merger of CTA, Metra, PACE, and RTA, you're going to really need someone who has an in-depth knowledge of not only CTA, but of all transit systems to help lead that.
Francia, you have been reporting on the fate of Acero schools, students, and families. Back in October, Acero Charter Schools announced they will be closing 7 schools in largely Latino neighborhoods. CPS and the Board of Education are considering a solution to keep some of the schools open long term, but parents have a ton of anxiety about all of the uncertainty and the back and forth. So, Francia, as of now, what is the plan?
It was announced December 20th, CPS board meeting, that the board approved the resolution essentially asking Acero to keep 7 schools open for the next school year. The district would chip in with a little bit of funding to kind of help with that. And then starting in the next school year, 2 schools would close and 5 would be transitioned to CPS. So that is what has been approved by the Board of Education. And I think one important aspect to that is that they don't really have control over Acero charter schools. They can make these recommendations, but the caveat there in that memorandum or that board resolution was that they might use that as a way to pressure Acero on whether they renew their contract for next school year or not, which then would kind of add pressure on the Acero charter network. That's what we know. It was a good thing for parents who want their schools open and want their children to be able to stay in school in their community. But I think there are a lot of unknowns at this time, just because we haven't seen Acero really say whether they agree with these plans or not, or what the proposal would be. And then one of the main points when covering the protests of parents and the calls for it, keeping the schools open, was that they wanted Acero schools to be the same. Like, even if CPS absorbed them, they want the same teachers, the same curriculum, the same classrooms, the same buildings. They want everything to stay the same. If these schools are absorbed by CPS, that's not going to be the case. So there are lots of unknowns there that I think need to be figured out before anyone can say this is a victory.
The board is planning to take a vote on turning 5 of the 7 charter schools, Cisneros, Casas, Fuentes, Tamayo, and Santiago, into CPS-run schools as early as 2026, 2027. Is that likely to pass and go through?
It's hard to tell. I think it might. But again, there are other considerations that need to be made, essentially, to ensure that these 5 schools stay open for the next school year so that they can transition to CPS, right? There's a year gap, and CPS has to cover that deficit, and Acero has to agree to keep the schools open, because otherwise there's no schools to keep open and transition to CPS. And that still hasn't been really communicated in terms to what Acero has agreed upon.
Michael, you dropped a story last week about preliminary data released by the Cook County Medical Examiner's Office, particularly around Cook County's overdose deaths in 2024. What are we learning from the numbers?
Thanks, Jacoby. So we're seeing that there was a 43% decrease in opioid overdose deaths in 2024 compared to 2023. That was 1,026 deaths last year from overdoses. And it's great progress. We're at nearly half the pandemic peak of 2,000 overdose deaths in 2022. And there is just a lot of advocacy and work behind it. So the other week, I went out to the offices of the Westside Heroin Opioid Task Force and saw just a lot of what they're doing in terms of getting out to the community, tabling, educating people on the risk of drugs. They distribute Narcan. They train people on how to use Narcan and other similar overdose reversal agents such as naloxone, the Suboxone. And it's just a lot of great work they're doing. So it's when you think about just the state of the opioid epidemic in America and the progress that public service and public health has done to not only make people aware of it, but in many ways destigmatize those conversations when it comes to people's families and thinking about addressing someone that may be dealing with substance abuse issues, getting someone treatment, making them aware of the risk.
Providing them with testing kits.
And that's something when you mentioned testing kits, they actually have fentanyl testing kits. So for people who are on drugs and for the time being still need to take drugs, being able to test and make sure that there's no fentanyl in there. And this is all great. And one thing that stands out to me is just the sad reality of drug use on the west side of Chicago, where it's been going up, where a third of the city's overdose deaths are on the west side. And in recent years, this proportion has just been increasing. So the need for groups like the West Side Heroin Opioid Task Force and lawmakers to be behind it. So with the task force, State Representative LaShawn Ford convened it. And he and I spoke, and he let me know that it's definitely not over as far as the work that's being done at the State House to help specifically the west side of Chicago. And in the lame duck session that concluded at the top of this month into this new legislative session, that's something for us to be on the lookout for, more statewide support.
Stories like this really highlight why it's so important for Chicagoans to be as involved in the budget process, for as cumbersome and as headache inducing as it can be. Task force pilot programs like the Chicago Department's pilot program to install Narcan vending machines. These type of small budget line items don't stand out in the big picture and often can be like a part of those big cuts we see at the city level. The state has a $3 billion budget hole they're going to have to fill. And so we have to be a part of this budget process to make sure we keep that pressure on lawmakers so that task force and pilot programs don't end up on the cutting room floor. Because as the data shows, when you've got nearly 90% of overdose deaths linked to things like fentanyl, testing kits matter. Like these things matter. Destigmatizing this matters because it truly saves lives. We finish every single episode the exact same way, with us begging you to bring your ass back here for the next episode so we can keep making more episodes. But before we do the begging, we got to do a little some good news. Francia, what is your good news for CityCast Chicago today?
Well, I saw this story that, McCormick Place installed this window film that has helped save or reduce bird collisions by 95%. So that I thought that's great news. It especially affects like the glare on windows especially affects migratory birds who collide with structures of all sizes, especially in the city of Chicago. So by installing this film with little dots, they were able to reduce the number of bird collisions and potentially bird deaths. So it's a little bit that, a big structure like that or a big organization like that can do, but any other building owner can do to really help birds get safely to wherever they're going through as they pass through our great city.
I don't think up until a couple of years ago, I had honestly even known how important solutions like this were. And then on October 25th, 2023, I think 1,000 birds died in one night from colliding with the McCormick Place. And then I learned more about how the Field Museum preserves birds. It was a whole rabbit hole that I ended up. But it is really good to see again just how one solution could make such a big difference. And from birds at McCormick Place to a coyote in Humboldt Park, Michael, what is your good news for CityCast Chicago today?
Earlier this week on Monday, there was a viral video of a coyote in a Humboldt Park Aldi. And it really stood out because you see officers looking, trying to find it, and you don't see it. And then it pops out of the refrigerated section. And people are just horrified to know that there was a coyote in there with their food and the produce. And then that's kind of it. Like, you see these viral videos and you wonder, like, what happens?
Hold on. There's like 20 seconds of just teaser action. Just they poking with like a broom. And you're like, am I about to see some mice? Am I about to see a raccoon? Am I about to see a possum? Like, all of the different Chicago animals and things in general running through my head through those first 20 seconds could not have prepared me for the last 13 seconds of that video.
Then it pops out, and then you hear the onlookers people start screaming. Somebody honks a horn.
You see the tail, and then
right.
it's out.
And typically with those viral videos, that's it. But this had a good outcome. The Flint Creek Wildlife Rehabilitation Center posted that they received the coyote from Animal Care and Control, and just spoke about the state of it. You know, it's frightened, and the reality of how human traffic in urban areas, a lot of wild animals in these very developed city areas like Chicago really don't know where to go. Animals like coyotes often just end up hiding from the human traffic in the best way they can. And for this little fella, it was in Aldi. So I'm glad that it's okay. Another coyote got hit at O'Hare, and thinking about ways that it could be better navigated to section off where animals are able to get to, but also doing it humanely. Because it always hurts my heart when I'm out walking down the street and I see those anti-bird spikes on the top of perches and stuff. And just seeing what is the best way so that's something we can all be thinking about.
I'm going to round us out with our CityCast Chicago Good News Animal Corner. The Brookfield Zoo is expecting its first dolphin birth since 2014. Allie, one of the zoo's bottlenose dolphins, is having a calf and is expected in sometime late spring, early summer. And so that's pretty damn exciting. And so between the dolphins, between Aldi, the coyote, and the thousands of birds who were spared by McCormick Place, I think this was a pretty good, successful round of some good news. I want to give a huge shout out to our guest today from Block Club Chicago, Francia Garcia Hernandez. Thank you for being here, my friend.
Thank you for having me. This was great. We got to do it more often.
Yes, ma'am. Michael Liptrot, thank you for being in the building.
Anytime, man. Thank you for having me.
Before we get out of here, I got to give a huge thank you to all of the people who make CityCast Chicago possible. Our executive producer is Simone Alisea. Our producer is Michelle Navarro. Our Hey Chicago senior newsletter editor is Sydney Madden. Our roving producer this week was Francisco Kilgore, and our roving newsletter editor was Adrian Gonzalez. The music we all love is from the homie Sam Thousand, All the Kimonos, and Mark Greenberg from the Mayfair Workshop. A quick reminder for everybody, we are off Monday for MLK Day. But in the meantime, in between time, if you enjoy the show, please share us with your friends and family. We're going to be back bright and early on Tuesday. We'll talk to you then. Peace. Francie, I'm going to start with you first. You want to sing? You don't have to if you don't want to.
I'm not tuned today, I might,
Okay. Michelle, cut that out. Cut me getting rejected out of there.